Welcome to the third Sunday in Lent. We've been exploring how again and again God meets us. Again and again we are called to listen. And today, again and again, we are shown the way. The first 2 weeks of Lent, we were in the Gospel of Mark. But beginning today and for the next several weeks, we will find ourselves in the Gospel of John. Right from the beginning, we notice that John and Mark are very different gospel accounts. Each gospel has its own take, its own audience and focus, its own way of recalling and interpreting the story. Mark was the earliest gospel, and the authors of Matthew and Luke both drew extensively from the Gospel of Mark. But John was written last, and it is very different from the other Gospels. In the baptism account in Mark that we explored a couple of weeks ago, the clouds opened up, and a voice claimed Jesus as beloved, God's Son in whom God was well pleased. But John, on the other hand, begins with a poem. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. Everything came into being through the Word, and without the Word, nothing came into being. What came into being through the Word was life, and the life was the light for all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't extinguish the light. The Gospel of John begins by telling us that the Word, wisdom of God, became flesh and dwelt among us in Jesus. In the beginning of John, after the poem, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. Jesus attracts and gathers disciples, curious disciples who are invited to come and see, will be shown the way by the one who will eventually tell them that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Nathanael asked, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." After gathering the disciples in an outpouring of abundant blessing, Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding in Cana. And all of this leads us to our passage for today. I'm reading from John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who were selling cattle, sheep, and doves, as well as those involved in exchanging currency, sitting there. He made a whip from ropes and chased them all out of the temple, including the cattle and the sheep. He scattered the coins and overturned the tables of those who exchanged currency. He said to the dove sellers, "Get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Passion for your house consumes me." When the Jewish leaders asked him, "By what authority are you doing these things? What miraculous sign will you show us?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jewish leaders replied, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But the temple Jesus was talking about was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Wow, this is a powerful scene in the Gospels. I think because it's not how we often think about Jesus, the teacher, the healer, the Prince of Peace. And yet all 4 Gospels contain this story, which means that it's really important. John's Gospel is very different from the Synoptic Gospels. A lot of the stories that John contains are not contained in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And conversely, a lot of the stories that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not contained in the Gospel of John. But this is one of the stories that appears in all four Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is his temple protest that gets Jesus his death warrant that leads eventually to crucifixion. But in John's Gospel, this cleansing of the temple happens early in Jesus' ministry, just following turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana. Jesus violently overturned tables. He made a whip, and he used it to really mess things up in the temple during Passover. This passage is oftentimes titled, Jesus Cleanses the Temple. I think cleansing the temple is a really interesting way to describe this scene in which Jesus really makes a mess of things in the cleanup process. Nyasha Jr. suggests that perhaps Jesus flips out, or Jesus loses it, or Jesus blows a gasket might be better subheadings for the text this week. Cleansing the temple seems to domesticate this scene in some way. But we can't miss this is a dramatic protest. Up until this scene in the Gospel of John, Jesus had made some friends and he'd made some wine. And so it leaves us to wonder, where is all of this coming from? What is Jesus so upset about? We know that it's Passover, which is one of the pilgrimage festivals when the Jews from all over would travel to Jerusalem to worship and to offer sacrifices in the temple. Now, sacrifices were meant to be perfect animals. And I imagine it was probably difficult to keep an animal perfect, unblemished over a long journey. And so the temple had become a marketplace. It was providing a service, making it easy for worshipers to purchase animals for their offerings. Of course, this brought lots and lots of money from other areas into Jerusalem. I don't know, perhaps it's because we've been looking at redlining and the effects of disinvestment in one area to benefit another area. But this has made me think this brought a lot of money from other areas into the Jerusalem economy. And then on top of this, there was a temple tax, which in and of itself was a barrier. If one wasn't able to pay the tax, they weren't able to gain access to God's house. And even those who could pay were exploited. The temple tax that was required to be paid in the proper currency. But people coming from all over brought with them all different kinds of currency. And of course, there were money changers who were happy. They had their tables set up. They were happy to help people to change their money into the proper currency for a fee, of course. And so the animal sellers and the money changers were all making money in God's house at the expense of God's agenda of feeding the poor and reaching out to the least of these and practicing social and economic justice and worshiping God in spirit and truth. But Jesus rejected the injustice of this system. Right from the beginning in Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of John, Jesus is set up as one of the prophets, like Jeremiah, who was critical of temple authority, who were placing barriers between God and God's people, rather than helping the least of these, as they were again and again reminded of their covenant obligations in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Instead, they were again and again turning God's house into a den of robbers. Again and again, the system was a mess. The temple authorities had gotten all tangled up with empire. The temple had taken 46 years to construct, and it was grand, it was glorious, because Herod had taken it on as a building project, a project that was authorized by Rome and paid for by temple taxes, those taxes that were serving as that barrier, keeping people separated from God. If this was God's house, and this was where the people were to come to be with God, then temple taxes were meant that the poor were denied access to God. But Jesus would not stand for this. Disrupting business as usual, Jesus rejected this system. A self-perpetuating system of privilege and power, which used its privilege and power to maintain its privilege and power rather than serve the least of these. Valuing people over property, Jesus protested against this system. And after the violent cleansing of the temple, Jewish authorities asked Jesus, "By what authority do you do this? Who gave you this authority? What miraculous sign will you show us? Do you have your proper permits?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jewish authorities thought, yeah, right. It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will build it up in 3 days? But the author of John helps us out a little by doing some interpretive work for us. Jesus said that they said that Jesus was talking about his body and not the building. The temple authorities were taking Jesus' word literally. Temple as building. The building that took 46 long years and lots of money to build. But Jesus is shifting the concept of temple, God's house, from a physical building to his body. To all bodies, I would suggest, when we worship in spirit and truth of our belovedness, we are temples of God. God has left the building and is located in the body. This is such an important message for the audience of John's gospel. Because remember, this was the last gospel to be written. And by the time it was written, the second temple was long gone. It had been destroyed. When your temple is in ruins, it's valuable to be able to locate God in your body. The actual temple had already been destroyed. All 46 years that it took to build and all the money that had been collected through tax to pay for it would come to naught. It had come to naught. While in John, this temple protest wasn't that precipitating event that led to the arrest of Jesus and crucifixion. Right from the beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of John, John is foreshadowing Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Raquel St. Clair Letsum wrote, the Jerusalem temple will be destroyed, but the temple of the Jewish man crucified outside Jerusalem will be raised to stand forever. This means that the presence of God in the world is no longer to be identified with a place, but now with a person. This is important stuff as we are in the middle of our Lenten journey, preparing our hearts and drawing closer to God. Because this raises central questions for us. Where is God located? Who has access? And who controls access? What or who is standing in the way of right relationship and wholeness? Again and again, we are shown the way, even as again and again we bear witness to the brokenness. It is not difficult to identify our current context within this passage. White supremacy, Christian nationalism, racism, Again and again and again and again, the story of domination, of destructive power and privilege, of religion entangled with empire, ravage God's dreams for creation. In the cleansing of the temple, Jesus reminds us that deconstruction is often necessary, and that is what comes before reconstruction, just as death comes before resurrection. In Jesus, God took on flesh so that we could see what it looks like to disrupt and overturn systems of corruption. God took on flesh to teach us another way. God took on flesh to point us to restoration. I'm going to close my message today with an affirmation of faith that was written by Sarah R. of a Sanctified Art. We believe in a God who knows holy rage, a God who stands with the underdog, who passionately protects the suffering, and who overturns systems of corruption. We believe in a God who leads by example, feeding the hungry, welcoming the children, offering water to the Samaritan, eating with the tax collector, healing the sick, preaching from the mountaintop, and offering second chances. We believe in a God who knew that we would lose our way and still said, "This is my body given for you." We believe in a God who knew our capacity for mistakes and still said, "I'm going to prepare a place for you." And because of this love, we believe that God shows us the way again and again and again. Thanks be to God. Amen.